The sun was setting over the city skyline as Captain Anderson wrapped up another long day at the Internal Affairs office. Her desk was covered with case files, each one telling a story of potential misconduct that needed her attention. But one particular file had been keeping her up at night for the past 3 months. A growing collection of civilian complaints against Officer Wilson. She took off her reading glasses and rubbed her tired eyes, thinking about how far she'd come in her 20-year journey on the force. As one of the few black women to rise through the ranks to become head of internal affairs, she'd faced her share of challenges. But this case was different. The pattern was clear. Officer Wilson had a habit of pulling over people of color for minor infractions, or sometimes no real reason at all. The problem wasn't just gathering evidence. It was gathering the right kind of evidence that would stand up to scrutiny. She'd seen too many valid complaints get dismissed because they couldn't prove intent. The system had a way of protecting its own, even when that protection came at the cost of justice. Looking at her watch, Anderson realized it was already past 8. The cleaning staff had come and gone, and the office floor was quiet except for the gentle hum of the air conditioning. She started packing up her things, carefully placing Wilson's file in her briefcase. Something told her she needed to review it again at home. As she walked to her car in the nearly empty parking garage, her phone buzzed with a text from her daughter. "Mom, don't forget to pick up milk on your way home." She smiled, remembering how her own mother had balanced family life with a demanding career. Now here she was, doing the same dance. The evening air was crisp as she pulled out of the garage in her personal car. A modest sit-in she'd bought last year. She preferred driving this instead of her department-issued vehicle when working late. It helped her blend in, feel normal, feel like just another citizen heading home after a long day's work. She could see the grocery store's sign a few blocks ahead when she noticed something in her rearview mirror. A patrol car had been following her for the past minute or so. Probably just routine, she thought to herself, but years of experience had taught her to trust her instincts. Something felt off about the way the patrol car was tailing her. Anderson did everything by the book. Perfect speed, perfect signaling, perfect lane changes. It was second nature after so many years on the force. But the patrol car stuck to her like glue, following her every move. She knew this game all too well, had seen it played out countless times in the complaints that crossed her desk. The grocery store was just ahead now, its fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow in the growing darkness. That's when she saw the flash of red and blue lights in her mirror. Her heart didn't race. Instead, a calm determination washed over her. She'd been here before, but never quite like this. As she pulled over, Anderson glanced at her briefcase on the passenger seat, knowing it contained the file of the very officer who might be approaching her car. 20 years of experience told her to stay calm, stay professional, and most importantly, stay aware. This traffic stop was about to become more than just another statistic. It was about to become evidence. She watched in her side mirror as the officer stepped out of his patrol car, his hand casually resting near his holster. In that moment, she wasn't Captain Anderson of Internal Affairs. She was just another black woman being pulled over at night, and she knew exactly how to handle what was coming next. Officer Wilson had been having what he considered a quiet night. 3 hours into his shift, he'd handed out a few speeding tickets and responded to a minor fender bender. Nothing exciting. That's when he spotted the silver sit-in making its way down Marshall Avenue. Something about it caught his eye, or maybe he was just bored and looking for action. He followed the car for several blocks, staying a few lengths behind. The driver seemed almost too careful, too precise in their movements. In his mind, that was suspicious enough. He'd learned over the years that people who drove that carefully were often hiding something. At least, that's what he told himself. The grocery store's bright lights illuminated the street ahead as Wilson flipped on his patrol car's spotlight, scanning the sedan's interior. A woman was driving alone. He could make out her silhouette against the glow of the dashboard. His pulse quickened slightly as he decided to make his move. He'd done this hundreds of times before, and tonight would be no different. The cruiser's light bar came to life, painting the street in alternating flashes of red and blue. The sit-in pulled over immediately, smooth and precise, like someone who'd done it before. Wilson called in the stop to dispatch, reading off the license plate number with practiced efficiency. Routine traffic stop, he reported, though there was nothing routine about his reason for pulling over this particular car. As he stepped out of his patrol car, Wilson adjusted his body camera without turning it on. He'd forget to activate it until he was already at the driver's window, an old trick that had served him well in the past. The night air had grown cooler, and his breath made small clouds in front of his face as he approached the seat-in, flashlight beam bouncing off the tinted rear windows. His hand rested casually on his holster, not gripping it, just letting it be known it was there. It was a subtle intimidation tactic he perfected over the years. The beam of his flashlight swept across the car's interior, revealing a professional-looking woman in business attire. He noticed a briefcase on the passenger seat and some files scattered on top of it. Still, he wasn't about to let appearances change his approach. License, registration, and insurance, he barked, not bothering with the usual courtesies. His tone was sharp, authoritative, the kind that often provoked a reaction he could use to his advantage. But the woman's movements remained calm and deliberate as she reached for her documents. The interior light clicked on, and Wilson could see her more clearly now. She was well-dressed, middle-aged, with an air of quiet confidence that slightly annoyed him. She handed over her documents without a word, her face a mask of composed dignity that made him even more determined to find something, anything, to justify this stop. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" he asked, his tone suggesting he was already tired of this interaction. The question was a trap, and they both knew it. Whether she admitted to something or denied any wrongdoing, he'd already decided how this stop would play out. "No, officer, I don't," she replied, her voice steady and clear. There was something in her tone that made him pause. Not defiance exactly, but a certainty that made him uncomfortable. He pushed the feeling aside, focusing instead on the paperwork in his hands. "You made an illegal lane change back there," he lied smoothly. Didn't signal for the full 100 feet before switching lanes. It was his go-to explanation, almost impossible to disprove without camera footage. He'd used it countless times before, and tonight it would serve its purpose once again. Little did Officer Wilson know, but his routine traffic stop was about to become anything but routine. As he walked back to his patrol car to run her information, he was completely unaware that every word, every action, every subtle intimidation tactic he'd just employed was being mentally documented by someone who had spent years investigating officers exactly like him. Inside her car, Captain Anderson kept her hands visible on the steering wheel, just as she taught countless civilians to do during community outreach programs. The irony wasn't lost on her. 20 years of law enforcement experience, and here she was, following her own advice while being wrongfully pulled over. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears, not from fear, but from a deep, quiet anger she'd learned to channel into purpose. Through her side mirror, she watched Officer Wilson's approaching figure, noting every detail of his behavior, the aggressive stance, the hand lingering near his weapon, the way he deliberately tried to intimidate her with his flashlight beam. "Keep it professional," she reminded herself. Years of training kicked in, but not her police training. Rather, it was the training every black parent gives their child about dealing with law enforcement. The same lessons she'd given her own daughter just a few years ago, when she'd gotten her driver's license. The interior light cast a soft glow as she reached for her documents with slow, deliberate movements. Her police badge was in her purse, but she left it there. This wasn't about pulling rank. This was about documentation, about experiencing firsthand what countless civilians had reported in their complaints. "License, registration, and insurance," the officer demanded, his tone dripping with unearned authority. She handed over her documents without a word, maintaining a calm exterior, while her trained eye caught every subtle sign of his prejudiced behavior. The way he barely looked at her face, the dismissive grunt when he took her paperwork, the slight curl of his lip. All of it familiar from the dozens of civilian complaints she'd reviewed. When he asked if she knew why he'd pulled her over, she responded with a simple, clear no, officer, I don't. She knew the game he was playing. It was all there in his case file, the false pretexts, the escalation techniques, the careful dance of pushing just far enough without crossing any clearly defined lines. His claim about an illegal lane change was exactly what she'd expected. She'd signaled properly at every turn. Her years on the force had made proper driving habits second nature. But she knew arguing would only escalate the situation. Instead, she stored away every detail, every word, every microaggression for the report she'd be writing tomorrow. The grocery store's fluorescent lights continued to buzz in the background as Officer Wilson walked back to his patrol car with her documents. She used these moments to center herself, remembering all the times she'd sat across her desk from citizens sharing similar stories. Their voices had often trembled with anger or fear as they described encounters just like this one. Her phone buzzed quietly in her lap, probably another text from her daughter about the milk. She left it untouched, knowing any movement could be misinterpreted. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every person who'd ever filed a complaint and been dismissed. Every citizen who'd faced this type of treatment and had no recourse. Through her rearview mirror, she could see Officer Wilson in his patrol car, running her information. She knew exactly what he would find, and a small part of her wished she could see his face when he realized who she was. But the larger part of her, the part that had fought for accountability and reform throughout her career, knew that this moment was bigger than personal satisfaction. In the quiet of her car, waiting for the inevitable return of Officer Wilson, Captain Anderson mentally prepared herself. Soon, he would discover that his routine traffic stop had just become evidence in an ongoing internal affairs investigation. But for now, she remained perfectly still, embodying the same dignity and restraint she'd always admired in those who'd sat across from her desk, sharing their stories of similar encounters. Inside his patrol car, Officer Wilson typed the license information into his computer with practiced efficiency. He'd done this thousands of times before, and he expected to find what he usually found. Maybe a minor violation he could use to justify the stop, or at least something to give him more time to fish for a bigger infraction. The computer hummed as it processed the search. Wilson took a sip of his now cold coffee, already thinking about how he'd write up this stop in his report. He'd use the usual phrases: suspicious behavior, furtive movements, officer safety concerns. The same old story, just a different night. Then the screen lit up with the search results. His coffee cup froze halfway to his mouth. He blinked hard, certain he must be reading it wrong. But the words stayed the same. Captain Anderson, Internal Affairs Division. A photo appeared on his screen, the same woman sitting in the car he just pulled over. The coffee cup slipped from his fingers, spilling across his lap, but he barely noticed. His mind raced through every word he'd said, every action he'd taken in the last few minutes. The way he'd approached her car, his tone, his body language, the lie about the lane change. All of it now felt like nails in his own coffin. No, 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 he muttered, quickly clicking through her file. 20 years on the force. Decorated officer. Current head of internal affairs. And worse, much worse, he recognized her name from somewhere else. The signature on the latest batch of civilian complaint investigations that had crossed his desk last week. Sweat began to bead on his forehead, despite the cool night air flowing through his patrol car's vents. His collar felt too tight, and his hands had gone clammy where they gripped the computer's keyboard. This wasn't just bad. This was career-ending bad. Back in her car, Captain Anderson maintained her composed waiting position, but she didn't need to see Officer Wilson's face to know exactly what was happening in his patrol car. The longer than usual delay told her everything. She'd seen it before, that moment when an officer realizes they've made a critical mistake. Finally, Wilson emerged from his patrol car. Through her mirror, she noticed the complete transformation in his body language. Gone was the swaggering confidence, replaced by a stiff, almost robotic movement. His hand, which had rested so casually on his weapon earlier, now hung awkwardly at his side. The beam of his flashlight was pointed at the ground now, not in her face, as he approached her window. She could see a dark stain on his uniform pants, probably spilled coffee from the moment of realization. Under different circumstances, it might have been almost funny. "Captain Anderson," he said, his voice cracking slightly on her title. "I apologize for the delay. I see you're with Internal Affairs." The forced politeness in his tone was a sharp contrast to his earlier behavior. She turned to look at him directly for the first time, her gaze level and professional. The same gaze she'd used in countless Internal Affairs interviews, the one that made officers squirm in their seats as they tried to explain their actions. "Yes, Officer Wilson, I am," she replied calmly, watching him flinch at her use of his name. "Is there anything else you need from me this evening?" His face had gone pale, and tiny beads of sweat were visible on his forehead in the grocery store's fluorescent glow. He fumbled with her documents, nearly dropping them as he handed them back. The swagger was gone, replaced by the nervous energy of someone who suddenly realizes they're standing on thin ice. "No, ma'am. Captain, you're free to go." "I apologize for any inconvenience," he stammered, taking a small step back from her car. His mind was undoubtedly racing through all the possible consequences of this encounter, unaware that this traffic stop was just the final piece of evidence in a much larger investigation. Captain Anderson watched as Officer Wilson shifted his weight from foot to foot, clearly struggling with what to do next. The power dynamic had flipped so completely that he seemed unable to follow his usual script. His right hand kept twitching toward his ticket book, then pulling back, as if unsure whether writing the ticket would make things better or worse. "Should I still?" He gestured vaguely with the ticket book, his voice uncertain. "I mean, about the lane change." The lie hung heavy in the air between them, made all the more obvious by his nervous stumbling over the words. "Please proceed as you would with any other traffic stop, officer," she replied, her voice carrying the weight of authority without raising its volume. She'd learned long ago that true power didn't need to shout to be heard. His hand trembled slightly as he wrote the ticket, making his usually sharp handwriting appear shaky and uncertain. Every few seconds, he would glance up at her, then quickly look away when he met her steady gaze. The same man who had approached her car with such unearned confidence just minutes ago now could barely maintain eye contact. The grocery store sign continued to buzz overhead, its fluorescent glare highlighting the sweat on Wilson's forehead. A few late-night shoppers walked to their cars, some slowing down to watch the scene unfold. Captain Anderson noticed how Wilson's awareness of these observers made him even more uncomfortable. Usually, an audience made officers like him feel more powerful, not less. As he handed her the ticket, she took it with the same calm demeanor she'd maintained throughout the encounter. She noticed how he pulled his hand back quickly to avoid any contact, as if she were now somehow dangerous to him. In a way, she supposed, she was. But not in the way he'd initially assumed when he decided to pull over a black woman driving alone at night. "You'll find my dashboard camera was running throughout this stop," she informed him, watching his face drain of what little color it had left. "As was my personal one." She gestured slightly to the small camera mounted discreetly on her windshield, its tiny red light blinking steadily. Wilson's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. His eyes darted between her face and the camera, the full implications of the situation clearly sinking in. Every move he'd made, every word he'd spoken, had been captured from multiple angles. "Have a good evening, Officer Wilson, she said, dismissing him with the same professional courtesy he'd failed to show her earlier. She could see him in her mirror as she started her car, standing frozen in the same spot, ticket book hanging limply at his side. As she pulled away from the curb, her phone buzzed again. Her daughter's text still waited. "Mom, don't forget the milk." The ordinary reminder brought a small smile to her face, a reminder that life went on even in the midst of moments like these. She did pull into the grocery store parking lot after all. Her daughter needed milk, and Captain Anderson had learned long ago not to let these encounters disrupt her life. As she walked through the fluorescent-lit aisles, she could see Officer Wilson's patrol car still sitting where she'd left him, his silhouette visible behind the wheel, probably making frantic calls to his union representative. Tomorrow, she would add this incident to his file. Tomorrow, she would begin the formal process of turning this traffic stop into the final piece of evidence in her investigation. Tomorrow, she would start the work of ensuring that what happened tonight wouldn't happen to anyone else. But tonight, she would buy milk for her daughter, drive home, and continue living her life with the same dignity and purpose that had carried her through 20 years on the force. Because that, too, was a form of resistance, refusing to let bias and prejudice disrupt the simple routines of daily life. The next morning arrived with a buzz of anticipation in the Internal Affairs office. Captain Anderson sat at her desk, reviewing the footage from the previous night. On her computer screen, multiple windows displayed different angles of the traffic stop: her dashboard camera, her personal camera, and the partial footage from Officer Wilson's body cam that had mysteriously only activated halfway through the stop. She'd arrived early, before most of her colleagues, wanting to process everything while it was still fresh in her mind. Her coffee sat untouched as she watched the scenes unfold again, this time from an investigator's perspective rather than a victim's. The office printer hummed as it produced copies of Wilson's previous complaints. 15 similar incidents in the past year alone, all following the same pattern. But this time was different. This time, there was undeniable proof from someone whose testimony couldn't be easily dismissed. A knock on her office door made her look up. Her assistant stood there, holding a fresh stack of papers. The dash cam footage from Officer Wilson's last 20 traffic stops just came in from technical, he said, placing the files on her desk. And you were right, there's a pattern. Captain Anderson nodded, unsurprised. She'd suspected that reviewing his other stops would reveal similar behavior. The data showed that over 80% of his discretionary stops involved minority drivers, far above the demographic makeup of the areas he patrolled. Her phone lit up with a message from the police union representative requesting an urgent meeting. She'd been expecting that too. Wilson must have spent the night making calls, trying to get ahead of what was coming. But this time, there would be no sweeping things under the rug. She pulled up the report she'd started drafting at home last night, after finally delivering that milk to her daughter. The words flowed easily. Every detail, every microaggression, every procedural violation carefully documented in clear, professional language. Her fingers paused over the keyboard as she remembered her daughter's face when she told her about the incident. "Mom, are you okay?" she'd asked, concerned. "I'm more than okay," Captain Anderson had replied. "I'm in a position to do something about it." The morning sun climbed higher as she worked, casting long shadows across her desk. Officers passed by her office, some glancing incuriously. Word had already started spreading about last night's incident. In a department this size, news traveled fast. She pulled up Wilson's personnel file on her screen. His record showed a history of commendations for high numbers of traffic stops and arrests, but looking deeper, a troubling pattern emerged. The complaints had started early in his career, but had always been dismissed for lack of evidence or insufficient proof of bias. A notification popped up on her computer. The chief of police wanted to meet. She'd worked with him long enough to know he'd want to handle this internally, to avoid bad publicity. But as she gathered her evidence into a comprehensive file, she knew this time would be different. Her investigation board now showed the full scope of the situation. Photos of previous complainants, transcript excerpts, statistical analyses of Wilson's traffic stops, and now, front and center, the footage from last night. Each piece alone might not have been enough, but together they told an undeniable story. As she reviewed the final draft of her report, Captain Anderson thought about all the people who'd sat in the chair across from her desk over the years, sharing similar stories. People who'd left feeling unheard, unseen, their experiences dismissed as misunderstandings or oversensitivity. This case wasn't just about one traffic stop or one officer. It was about setting a precedent, about showing that no one was above accountability, that wearing a badge didn't give anyone the right to discriminate. The evidence was clear, the documentation thorough, and Captain Anderson was ready to ensure that this time, justice would be served through proper channels. The hearing room felt smaller than usual that morning. Early sunlight filtered through the vertical blinds, casting striped shadows across the long conference table. Officer Wilson sat at one end, flanked by his union representative and department-appointed attorney. His usual confident posture was gone, replaced by tense shoulders and nervous glances. Captain Anderson sat opposite them, her evidence files neatly arranged before her. The police chief and 3 senior review board members filled the remaining seats. The only sound was the gentle whir of the air conditioning and the occasional shuffle of papers. "Let's begin," announced the senior board member, his voice breaking the heavy silence. The room felt charged with tension as he read out the list of allegations: racial profiling, abuse of power, false reporting, and pattern of discriminatory behavior. Wilson's attorney leaned forward. "My client has an exemplary record of service," he began, but Captain Anderson was ready. She clicked a button on her laptop, and the wall screen came to life with statistics. "These graphs show Officer Wilson's traffic stop patterns over the last 3 years," she explained, her voice steady and professional. "Note the disproportionate targeting of minority drivers, particularly in areas where they represent less than 20% of the population." The room grew quieter as she continued presenting evidence. Video clips played silently on the screen. Dozens of traffic stops showing the same aggressive approach, the same intimidation tactics. Wilson shifted uncomfortably in his chair as his past behavior played out before everyone. "And now," Captain Anderson said, clicking to the next file, "footage from my own traffic stop 3 nights ago." The room watched as the scene unfolded from multiple angles. Wilson's approach, his hand near his weapon, his aggressive tone, and then the dramatic shift in his behavior upon discovering her identity. Wilson's union representative tried to interrupt. "This is just one incident." "One incident that perfectly matches the pattern," Captain Anderson cut in, pulling up side-by-side comparisons with previous stops. Same approach, same false pretense, same intimidation tactics. The only difference was that this time, he chose the wrong target. She could see Wilson's face reddening as she played the audio of his false lane change accusation, followed by GPS data showing her perfect compliance with traffic laws. His attorney whispered something in his ear, but he shook his head sharply. "Would you like to explain your actions that night, Officer Wilson?" the board member asked, his tone making it clear this wasn't really a question. Wilson straightened in his chair, trying to reclaim some dignity. "I was just doing my job," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Traffic enforcement is vital to public safety." "Traffic enforcement is indeed vital," Captain Anderson agreed, switching to her next slide. "But these heat maps show your enforcement patterns clearly target certain demographics while ignoring actual high-accident areas of your patrol zone." The evidence continued to mount. Witness statements from previous stops, statistical analyses, expert testimony on racial profiling patterns. With each new piece of evidence, Wilson seemed to shrink further into his chair. His attorney made a last attempt. "My client is willing to undergo additional training." "This isn't about training," Captain Anderson interrupted, her voice firm but controlled. Officer Wilson's dashboard camera shows he turns it off during certain stops but leaves it running for others. That shows intent. That shows he knows exactly what he's doing. She could feel the weight of the room's attention as she stood up, walking to the screen where Wilson's pattern of behavior was displayed in undeniable detail. This isn't a single mistake to be corrected with training. This is a deliberate pattern of discriminatory behavior that undermines public trust and violates everything that badge stands for. The board members exchanged glances. Wilson stared at the table. His earlier bravado completely evaporated. His union representative was frantically flipping through papers, looking for something, anything, to counter the mountain of evidence before them. But there was nothing to find. Captain Anderson had built an airtight case, documenting a clear pattern of behavior that could no longer be ignored or explained away. As the board called for a brief recess to deliberate, the look on their faces made it clear. This time, there would be real consequences. 2 weeks after the hearing, Captain Anderson stood at the podium in the police department's press room. Camera flashes punctuated the air as she announced the review board's decision and the department's new initiatives. Officer Wilson's termination was just the beginning of a larger transformation. Today marks a turning point, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed room. The board's decision sends a clear message. Bias and discrimination have no place in law enforcement. She could see her daughter sitting in the back row, beaming with pride as her mother addressed the reporters. Behind her, the police chief and senior board members sat in a row, their presence lending weight to the announcement. The same chief who had initially wanted to handle things internally now publicly supported comprehensive reform. Amazing what irrefutable evidence could accomplish. Effective immediately, all patrol vehicles will be equipped with upgraded camera systems that cannot be manually deactivated, she continued. The reporters' pens scratched against notepads as she outlined the new accountability measures. Additionally, regular analysis of traffic stop data will be conducted to identify potential patterns of bias. In the audience, she recognized faces from previous complaints. Citizens who had come forward over the years, whose stories had been dismissed for lack of evidence. Today, they watched as their experiences finally led to real change. Her phone buzzed quietly in her pocket, probably another message from her daughter. Last night, they'd had a long talk about justice, about standing up for what's right, about being in a position to make change happen. "You didn't just get justice for yourself, Mom," her daughter had said. "You got it for everyone who couldn't." The questions from reporters came rapid fire. Will there be reviews of other officers' stop patterns? How will the department ensure compliance? What message does this send to the community? Captain Anderson answered each one with the same steady confidence she'd shown throughout the investigation. After the press conference, she returned to her office to find it filled with flowers and thank you cards from community members. One card caught her eye. It was from a young woman whose complaint against Wilson had been dismissed 6 months ago. "Thank you for hearing us," it read simply. She sat at her desk, looking at the now empty evidence board where Wilson's case had been displayed. In its place hung a new departmental directive outlining the reforms. Mandatory body cameras, regular data analysis, enhanced civilian oversight, and most importantly, a clear message that bias would not be tolerated. Her computer screen showed emails pouring in from police departments across the country, requesting information about implementing similar reforms. What had started as one traffic stop was spreading, creating ripples of change throughout law enforcement. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. It was one of her junior officers, holding a fresh stack of files. "New complaints just came in, Captain," he said, placing them on her desk. "And this time, we're ready to investigate them properly." She nodded, reaching for the first file. The work wasn't over. It was really just beginning. But now they had a precedent, a protocol, and most importantly, proof that the system could work when people in power chose to do what was right. As the afternoon sun slanted through her office window, Captain Anderson thought about all the parents who had to have the talk with their children about police interactions. Maybe, just maybe, her work would help change that conversation. Maybe the next generation would grow up in a world where justice wasn't just a word, but a reality. Her daughter's text from earlier finally made her smile. "Mom, you were amazing. Dinner tonight to celebrate." She typed back a quick yes, then turned to the new files on her desk. There was more work to be done, more changes to make, more justice to ensure. Because that's what real change looked like. Not just one victory, but a continuing commitment to do better, to be better, to ensure that every person, regardless of who they were, could trust those sworn to protect and serve them. The story of one traffic stop had ended, but the story of real change was just beginning.